Part 2. The Grayling Fae, Chapter 14. Back into the Doove. Maisie. The first time I went into the Doove Dorca, was it only day before yesterday? It took all my nerve to force myself to take that first step from sunlit field to forest. Only my desperate search for a cure for my terminally ill sister gave me the courage. Even then, on a bright, clear afternoon, I nearly backed out and ran home. As little as only a few inches in, the forest became immediately terrifying. The call of the birds sounded different and ominous. The feeling of being watched was frighteningly intense. A sense of doom and evil pervaded the air. I'd had Morel's directions to guide me in then, and the hope of the rose to guide me out. Even with them, I'd entered the forest in broad daylight, and it had taken me hours and hours to slowly pick my way through the tangled underbrush to the rose. But today, as an early dusk approached, and the sky was gray and angry, there was no hope of the waning moon helping us. Though twilight lasts unnaturally late in the Doove, even in autumn, it was never lighter than twilight in the Doove under the best of circumstances. Or so Morel the witch had warned me. Lord Noblett and his crew had no such reservations, fears, or squeamishness about entering the Doove. The ornate king's carriage I rode in jounced across the roadless field as if by magic, heading for the Doove at breakneck speed as if preparing to breach a barrier. I expected at least the horses to have enough sense or instinct to be afraid, but even they seemed fearless. Their hoofs pounded without pause. Nary a neigh nor a whinny cracked the cadence. Another enchantment. How deep did this magic go? I hunkered down in my corner of the carriage, bracing myself for the darkness and sense of despair that went with travel in the Doove. As I looked out the window for a final glimpse of the tiny croft that was home, I saw a strange dark fog rising over the hill from where the lake and castle should be, blocking any help from the Earl. Not that I expected any. A chase? Yes. Help? No. If the Earl and his men came after us and caught me, I'd be a dead woman. Out of revenge, if nothing else. I wasn't exactly sure what the procedure was after that. Would the Selectress position go to the second choice of young woman in our province? That would surely be Lady Brinley. Or would the king pick a queen from the next province in the succession? Would my death, before I even met him, get him the princess he desired all along? If that were the case, I wasn't coming out of the Doove alive, that much was certain. What an easy, convenient place for me to meet with a tragic, accidental death. Who would doubt that the forest had taken me? Lord Noblett was perhaps even more diabolical and cunning than I'd previously given him credit for. Dispose of me before having to present such an inferior beauty to the king. What an embarrassment presenting a crofter's plain daughter would be. To be honest, this was all speculation on my part. I had no idea of the actual legalities of Selectress succession. I was no lawyer or legal scholar, nor had I ever really cared about the process. I'd never thought it would affect me personally. The prior 3 Selectresses had died before becoming queen, and yet the succession went to the next province in the plan. However, they'd all been officially presented to the king and worn his ring. He had made a show of welcoming them. I wore his ring, true. Was that enough? As far as I knew, once the selection was made by his agent, the betrothal was legally binding. At least it seemed that way, given how Lord Noblett had stuffed the ring on my gloved finger and made the proclamation aloud. Oral contracts were legally binding, especially when witnessed. It didn't matter in this case that I hadn't given my consent. The king's was all that was necessary. One-party consent. If one of the parties were the crown. My position was precarious at best. But I suddenly feared for Catri's life even more than my own. My selection hadn't been public in the village square with all the citizens as witnesses. Only Lord Noblett, the Earl, his men, who he could blackmail or buy off, and Catri could verify it. And But no one besides me could see him. All of that made it theoretically possible that the Earl could kill me and still get his daughter into the position, by prying the ring off my dead finger and putting it on his daughter. Only Katri stood in his way. And if he eliminated her, who would care or object? Lord Noblett was another obstacle to the Earl. But I didn't think that would save either Katri or me. If Lord Noblett had wanted Lady Brinley, he would have selected her in the first place. But the desperate Earl could hope or believe that Lord Noblett could be bought off. Every man had his price. The ring? Would it buy me anything? Its value was beyond my imagination. If I escaped, it could set me up for life. But how do you pawn the king's ring? Who would take the risk of buying it? They'd never be able to sell it. I clenched my hand around it. The Doove was so close now that the shadows were already reaching out to overcome us. One more stride, one more horse length, and we'd plunge into the darkness. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the impact of darkness and despair. The horses charged into the woods without pausing. There was no road and no path for them to follow, but that neither slowed nor deterred them. The dense twilight enveloped us. The sense of suffocating evil fell over me like a veil. I expected the Doove to rebel at our presence, to reject our intrusion of its privacy, to send branches to reach out to grab us and scrape the carriage to a halt, for roots to grab at the carriage wheels and horses' heels, for dark, nearly invisible holes to suddenly open in the uneven forest floor, to swallow horses' legs and snap them like the twigs around us. But the horses didn't slow, nor did they dodge trees. Instead, the trees and brush moved out of our way. A road as smooth as a well-planed board and as soft as a feather down opened before us. The carriage rode smoothly along the forest floor without slowing, even in the dark. Even though we had no runners carrying torches to light the way, the horses seemed to be able to see without light. I realized with horror that in the dark of the Doove Dorca, I had no excuse not to drop my coverings and reveal myself once we stopped. That Lord Noblett would surely want to see for himself the beauty he'd grabbed. If he were able to see without light, like the horses and other riders apparently could. The way things were going, I had little doubt he could. I couldn't make any sense out of it. Logic wouldn't let me. He must have known from the beginning how plain I really was. He must have heard the village gossip. I was sure he had spies everywhere. The king's men always did wherever they went. There wasn't one truthful person who knew me, who would call me a beauty. Certainly not more beautiful than Lady Brinley. But maybe none of that mattered. Maybe he didn't need to see me, not if he was going to kill me the instant we stopped. Much as I tried to explain things away, or think of some other scenario, killing me quickly in the forest was the only logical conclusion I could make. My eyes slowly began to adjust to the dark, at least enough so that I could make out shapes. A shadow blacker than the dark of the Doove passed the carriage window. I jumped. My breath caught. The fear Dorca. Terror welled in my throat, blocking any scream I might try to make. My heart nearly stopped. I was back in his territory. Back where he could stalk me and finish off what he'd started. I'd interrupted the Darkling's plans and added insult by injuring him. He'd want his revenge on me, and he'd want it painful. Outside the carriage, the king's soldiers were laughing and talking to each other now, as if entering this horrible place gave them cover and they had nothing to fear. Couldn't they feel the dark shadows? Hadn't they seen the mist move? Weren't they afraid of stumbling in the dark? A pair of them pulled up and kept pace just outside my window. I let my chin fall onto my chest, closed my eyes, and pretended to sleep, hoping they'd let down their guard and let some vital information slip. Their conversation was mostly bawdy. Talk of whores they planned to bed as soon as they got back to Royal Circle. Of the gaming dens, where they eagerly anticipated losing their wages. Of course, they didn't see it that way. They dreamed of winning their fortunes. They were nattering fools to the extreme. I was almost insulted at having to listen to their drivel. I was the presumptive future queen. Could I command them to shut up so I could live my last few hours in peace, or at least quiet? Just as my patience was on the verge of breaking, one of them said, "Poor mite in there. Heard she's plain as a piece of day-old bread. The whole of her province misfits." He spit the word out. "But as she's not a beauty as well, it's a double curse." "Dry as day-old bread, is she?" the other one hooted and slapped his thigh. "Dry? I'd like to give her a test ride and find out." "You're desperate, my man. It's dark here. And she's free, isn't she? I don't need to see her face." The soldier laughed. "It's treason to soil the king's goods." "Right. She's not going to make it out of this forest. Her body will never be found. The king will never know his precious Selectress was ruined." He lowered his voice. I had to strain to hear the rest. "His lordship wants the ring back, and her beautiful little finger to present to the king as proof of how well he chose for his majesty." It was all I could do not to gasp. Of course. At last it makes sense. He didn't know my entire left hand was beautiful. His lordship will pay whoever does the deed to keep his mouth shut. And pay him well. That's why I say, a quick fuck with her wouldn't do anyone any harm. Bragging rights too, to know you had the king's intended, even if he never intended to bed her himself. I swallowed hard against the rising nausea, fighting not to vomit in my throat. The hint of dark mist moved again in the woods, keeping pace with the carriage. As hard as I thought, as optimistic as I tried to be, I couldn't think of any way to save myself and my life. I was doomed. It was only a matter of who I preferred to take my life, and how to negotiate the least painful and degrading death. My choices weren't phenomenal. The Earl was out. There was no sign of him giving chase in the forest. I could make a run into the forest, and let it do its job. Death by cougar or bear or monster. Or best case, death by thirst or starvation or just plain fear. None of them sounded remotely pleasant. I could let myself be taken by the fear Dorca. But I doubted he could be bribed to be merciful. I couldn't even let myself imagine how he'd toy with me. Or I could throw myself on the mercy of the soldier charged with killing me. Bribe him to do the job quickly and without violating me. But with what? I twisted the ring on my gloved finger. I couldn't let Lord Noblett get the betrothal ring back. It would be my revenge on him. It was the only thing I had of value on my person, but I would have to get rid of it somehow. Using it to save my life was out of the question. Any of the soldiers would be foolish to accept it anyway. If they were caught with it, it would mean instant hanging or worse. I had no idea how long we kept going into the forest. I lost track of time. Eventually, we'd have to stop to rest and water the horses. Unless they were enchanted to not need sustenance or rest either. But I doubted that. If that had been the case, the king's party would have reached us even sooner in the outlands. My guess, from the snatches of conversation I overheard, was that we would have to camp at least one night in the forest. And since we'd crashed into the Doove in late afternoon, I surmised we'd have to stop soon. I also guessed I wouldn't last the night. If I were Lord Noblett, I would want me killed as deeply in the forest as possible. And why carry the baggage, me, any farther than he had to? If we were in the middle of the forest, and I were him, I'd kill me before bed. I assumed he had a way of preserving my little finger to hold its beauty long enough to show the king. Perhaps a day's ride wouldn't do it any harm. As far as I knew, the rose had enchanted it so that it would never decay. It would be beautiful always. Even as I finished my tortured thought, Lord Noblett shouted a command. The carriage rocked to a stop. A somber-faced soldier opened the door, reached in, grabbed me by the arm and roughly dragged me out of the carriage. I stumbled forward as he released me, coming to a stop before Lord Noblett and the lamp he held. "Put that lamp out." My pulse roared in my ears. "You'll call down the wrath of the fairies and alert the monsters in the forest to our presence." Lord Noblett laughed darkly. "Superstitious, are you? Isn't that quaint? The witch Morel warned me. And trusting of witches. He was goading me. I can handle monsters." The shadows still seemed to be watching, but they held their distance. Lord Noblett's bravado only enforced the idea that the king had made an alliance with the Fairy Queen and been guaranteed safe passage through her forest. The feared Dorca was her servant. If he came, I'd bid him take Lord Noblett first, but I doubted it would do me any good. I guessed he had orders not to touch the king's men. Too bad. I'd have liked the satisfaction of seeing the arrogant noble die before my eyes. Suit yourself. Any consequences be on your head. I glared at his lordship and his smug expression, wanting to knock the lamp out of his hand and run. Is dragging me out of the carriage any way to treat your future queen? My soldier wasn't gentle enough with you? Lord Noblett clucked his tongue and sneered in the sharp light the lamp cast on his angular face. Maybe if you hadn't cowered in the corner. Maybe if you'd stepped out bravely of your own accord. The kingdom doesn't want a coward for a queen. I balled my fists. We'll camp here for the night, Lord Noblett said. My men and I will be sleeping on the ground beneath the trees. You can join us or sleep in the carriage. Your choice. No tent. Are you going to ask my exhausted men to accommodate your every need when they've already protected you into the heart of the Doove? His eyes glittered in the light. The carriage will do. Excellent. He dropped the lamp to his side. You've had a long ride. I'm sure you want some privacy to relieve yourself before settling in for the night. He snapped his fingers. A soldier appeared at his side. It's not safe for a woman to venture into the forest alone, not even a few feet. This man will accompany you. There are plenty of bushes to squat behind nearby. He'll avert his eyes, believe me. He meant it as an insult, that I was so ugly none of his men would want to look. Not that they valued their king's betrothed. I turned my gaze to the soldier. He did avert his eyes right then. Which was when I knew. He had instructions to kill me. I wasn't coming back from relieving myself alive.